The cool air of the Swiss Alps hit Ethan Moore's face as he stepped onto the narrow trail, his boots crunching on the loose gravel beneath him. At 32, he'd expected to feel more grounded by now, especially after everything that had happened. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, the familiar weight of it offering some small sense of security. The journey ahead was supposed to bring him peace, but all he could think about was how he felt more lost than ever. Ethan had always been a man who chased after success, not just in his career, but in his personal life as well. He had been determined to make things work with Liam, his partner of 5 years. But despite all the effort, despite the late nights of whispered promises and the unspoken hope that things could be fixed, everything had crumbled. The divorce had been final 2 months ago, and the weight of it was heavier than any pack he'd carried up this mountain. He had thought the fresh mountain air would clear his mind, that the silence of the Alps would offer him the solitude he craved. But the moment he stepped off the train at the base of the mountain, it felt like the mountains were mocking him, towering, indifferent, and somehow impassive to his pain. They stood as they always had, but for the first time, Ethan realized they didn't care about him or his problems. He was just another human, wandering through their vastness. "Focus," he muttered to himself, shaking his head as he adjusted the straps on his backpack. He was here for one reason: to find something, anything, that would allow him to step out of the cloud of doubt that seemed to follow him wherever he went. This hike was meant to give him clarity, a chance to reset, but so far, it was only amplifying the silence that had come to define his life. Ethan pushed forward, the trail winding through dense forest, the path steep and treacherous in parts. The air was thin here, and the climb, though not particularly challenging, left him breathless. His thoughts wandered aimlessly as he moved, following the trail like he followed his life, blindly. He thought about his career, his failed relationship, and the pile of unanswered emails waiting for him back in Zurich. He hadn't even bothered to check his phone before he left. It was a conscious decision to disconnect, but now he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he should have stayed and sorted things out instead of running to the mountains. The only thing he could focus on as his boots hit the gravel was the rhythmic crunching of his steps and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. For a moment, he let himself breathe deeply, inhaling the scent of pine and fresh earth. This was what he had been searching for, wasn't it? Peace. Quiet. A way to shut off the noise in his head. By noon, he reached a clearing that overlooked a valley. The view was breathtaking, stretching far beyond what he could see on any map. A river wound through the lush green trees, sparkling like liquid silver under the afternoon sun. Ethan paused, setting down his pack and sitting on a rock, the tension in his chest easing slightly. This was why he had come. To feel small in the best possible way, to remind himself that there was a world out there that didn't care about his problems. He unwrapped a protein bar, chewing it absent-mindedly, his thoughts still swirling around his failed marriage and his sense of failure. The sun warmed his back as he ate, and for a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to forget about everything. He could almost pretend that life wasn't falling apart, that he didn't feel like a shell of the person he used to be. He sighed deeply, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, then stood up. He had a goal: reach the ridge by evening, get some decent rest, and continue his journey the next day. But as he began the climb again, the air grew thinner, and the weight of his thoughts felt heavier. It was then that he heard it. A faint growl, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively moving to the knife strapped to his waist. His heart began to pound as he scanned the forest around him, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it a bear? A cougar? He'd read about the wildlife here, and though he wasn't unfamiliar with the dangers of the wilderness, his fear of the unknown sent a chill up his spine. He shook his head, trying to calm himself. "You're being paranoid," he whispered, though the tension in his chest only grew. The wind shifted, carrying the sound again, a low growl, distant but close enough to send a shiver through his body. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dark shadows between the trees. But nothing moved. He told himself again to relax. He was just being cautious, overthinking the situation. Yet, with every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, his gaze darted to the edges of the trees. Was he being watched? As evening drew near, Ethan reached his planned campsite, a small patch of flat land tucked into a sheltered grove. The sun was setting, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, but the growing unease in his gut made the beauty of the view feel hollow. He set up his tent with shaky hands, the frustration bubbling over when the stakes refused to go into the hard-packed earth. He hit his thumb with the mallet, a curse escaping his lips. Exhaustion began to overtake him as he crawled into the sleeping bag. The wilderness was stunning, but it also felt vast and unforgiving. Ethan, for the first time, realized how alone he truly was. This wasn't a retreat to find himself, it was a retreat from everything he feared, from the pain of loss, the failure that had defined the past few months. The silence outside his tent felt suffocating, and his mind wouldn't stop. What if something went wrong? What if he wasn't cut out for this anymore? As the shadows deepened, Ethan closed his eyes, hoping for sleep. He thought about his last conversation with Liam, how he had ignored the warnings, how he had buried himself in work instead of facing the issues that had torn them apart. The wind howled outside, and in the distance, the growl came again, a faint exhale carried on the wind, sending a shiver down his spine. But he didn't hear it for long, as sleep, restless and elusive, pulled him under. Ethan woke to the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply breathe, the air crisp and cool, the chirping of birds overhead filling the silence around him. The storm that had swept through the night was gone, leaving only a faint mist clinging to the treetops. Ethan sat up in his tent, stretching his stiff body, the discomfort from his broken sleep starting to settle in his joints. The pain in his leg was a dull ache now, a reminder of the journey he had started the day before. The wilderness had begun to feel less like a peaceful escape and more like a challenge, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. But he couldn't back out now. Not after everything. With a groan, he pulled himself from the tent, careful to avoid jostling his leg too much. His backpack lay nearby, the weight of it suddenly feeling more like a burden than a comfort. Ethan made quick work of packing his things, boiling water for instant coffee, and gnawing on a granola bar. His thoughts kept circling back to Liam, to the feeling of inadequacy that still gnawed at him. No amount of solitude would fix what he had broken, but maybe, just maybe, it would help him put things into perspective. As he shouldered his pack and began walking again, the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of him. The path grew narrower, the terrain rougher as the incline steepened, taking him up toward the ridge he hoped to reach by evening. Each step was a struggle, but Ethan was used to pushing through discomfort. That's what he had done for years: work, relationships, everything. Push, push, push. But now, that drive felt empty, as though he had spent all this time striving for things that didn't really matter. And then, without warning, it happened. Ethan's boot slipped on a loose rock, and the ground beneath him shifted. He didn't have time to react. His foot shot out from under him, and in that brief moment of panic, he flailed to regain his balance, but it was too late. He tumbled down the ravine, the rock scraping his skin, his body jerking violently as gravity took over. The world spun as he rolled, slamming into the jagged edges of the rocks, the air knocked out of him with each impact. Finally, he came to a painful halt against a sharp outcrop of stone, gasping for air, his chest heaving in agony. His vision blurred as pain surged through him, his head pounding and his body screaming in protest. Ethan could barely make sense of what had just happened. His left leg felt like it was on fire, and when he tried to move it, a searing pain shot through his body. Panic set in. His breath came in shallow gasps as he fumbled for his phone, the hope of calling for help flickering in his mind. But when the screen lit up, the dreaded words stared back at him: no signal. He cursed under his breath, frustration boiling over. He was alone, completely alone, with no way to communicate with anyone. He tried to move but could barely shift his position without feeling the excruciating pain in his leg. He had to stabilize it, stop the bleeding, but how? His mind raced, trying to put together the pieces. The ravine was steep, and his body was surrounded by dense underbrush. He had no idea how far he had fallen, how deep this ravine went, or where the trail was anymore. Ethan swallowed hard, the bitter taste of fear filling his mouth. What do I do now? The logical part of his mind tried to take over, stop the bleeding, stabilize the leg, find shelter, but his heart hammered in his chest, the overwhelming weight of his situation making it difficult to think clearly. How long could he survive here? Would anyone find him? He had told a coworker about his trip, but the details were vague. He had only mentioned that he was going for a hike in the mountains. No one knew exactly where he was. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping. The shadows in the ravine stretched long and ominous. Ethan wrapped himself in the emergency blanket from his pack, but it provided little warmth. He could hear the distant rustling of leaves, the wind picking up again, and his thoughts spiraled out of control. A low growl broke the silence, and Ethan froze, his body tensing. It wasn't his imagination, he had heard it clearly. The growl was low, distant, but unmistakable. He scanned the shadows nervously, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it a bear? A cougar? No, don't panic, he told himself, trying to keep calm, but the fear was overwhelming. He had read enough about the wildlife in these parts to know that bears were common in the area, but that didn't make him feel any safer. The growl sounded again, louder this time, and closer. Ethan held his breath, feeling his body go cold. What should he do? The wilderness, which had once seemed so peaceful and calming, now felt like a vast, uncaring expanse. And then, out of the shadows, the creature appeared. A massive brown bear, its shaggy coat rippling with muscle, stepped into the clearing of the ravine. Its eyes gleamed with intelligence, and its nose twitched, sniffing the air. It was huge, easily 3 times Ethan's size, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to do something, move, run, get away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed by fear and pain, unable to escape. He could only watch as the bear approached, its massive paws barely making a sound against the damp earth. The bear stopped a few feet away, its gaze locking with Ethan's. For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. Every fiber of his being told him to be still, to not provoke the animal, but the fear clawed at his chest. This was it. After everything, his fall, his isolation, he was going to be a bear's meal. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable swipe of claws, the crushing bite that would end everything. But it didn't come. Instead, the bear let out a low, rumbling huff. It stepped back, circling him slowly, as if assessing him. Ethan couldn't believe what was happening. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why wasn't it attacking? Was the bear merely curious? Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The bear lay down a few feet away from him, stretching out its massive body on the ground. Its gaze never left Ethan, but it wasn't aggressive, it was watching. Watching him, as if waiting. Ethan's heart slowed, the initial surge of panic giving way to confusion. The bear had done nothing to harm him. In fact, it seemed indifferent. Ethan's mind was too foggy to understand the implications of this moment, but something in the bear's presence felt strange, protective, even. His leg throbbed painfully, but he didn't move. The fear that had gripped him since the fall had faded, replaced by an odd sense of curiosity. What was this creature doing? Why hadn't it attacked him? The bear blinked slowly, its eyes never leaving his, and Ethan couldn't help but feel something. A connection, maybe. Not one that made him feel safe, but one that made him feel watched. As the day wore on and the evening settled in, Ethan could only watch the bear, too stunned to react, too weak to do anything but stay still. The creature, for reasons Ethan couldn't comprehend, had chosen to stay near him. It wasn't just any bear, it was a silent guardian in the heart of the wilderness. The night passed in uneasy silence. Ethan barely slept, his mind consumed by the strange presence of the bear. The pain in his leg made it hard to find any position that was comfortable, and the cold seeped into his bones despite the emergency blanket wrapped tightly around him. Every rustle in the wind, every snap of a twig in the distance, sent a jolt of panic through his chest. Yet, the bear lay a few feet away, calm, its massive form stretched out on the ground, watching him with an air of indifference. By the time dawn broke, the light creeping slowly through the canopy above, Ethan was exhausted. His ribs ached, his leg throbbed relentlessly, and his mind felt foggy. But when he opened his eyes, the sight of the bear was the first thing he saw. It hadn't left. In fact, it hadn't moved at all since the night before, its head resting on its paws, its gaze unwavering. Ethan's heart raced as he sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in his leg. It was a dull, persistent ache now, but it was clear that the injury needed attention. He wasn't a wilderness expert, but he'd read enough survival guides to know that without proper medical care, things could get a lot worse. Infection, shock, and dehydration were all real threats in the wild, and without any way to communicate with the outside world, his chances of survival felt increasingly slim. He looked at the bear again. The bear hadn't attacked, it hadn't shown any aggression, yet. But it was there, a constant presence in his deteriorating situation, something both frightening and comforting in equal measure. Okay, Ethan muttered to himself, trying to push past the fear that gripped him. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that his situation wasn't hopeless. Not yet. The bear had shown no signs of hostility, and in some strange way, Ethan felt like the animal was simply there. Watching. Waiting. As though it was waiting for him to make a decision. To do something. And that's when it happened. The bear rose to its feet, its large frame stretching out, its muscles rippling under its shaggy coat. It turned its head, sniffing the air, and for a moment, Ethan thought it might leave. Instead, it began to move. Its paws were silent against the ground, and it moved with a deliberate grace that Ethan couldn't help but admire. The bear walked past him, its eyes flicking in his direction as if to make sure he was still there. Then, it stopped a few feet away, sniffing at the underbrush. Ethan watched, confused and curious, wondering what the bear was doing. It seemed to be searching for something. After a moment, it pawed at the dirt, revealing a patch of small, bright berries hidden beneath the leaves. The bear nudged the berries toward Ethan, dropping them with a soft snort before looking at him again. Ethan stared at the berries, unsure of what to make of the offering. He hadn't seen any other signs of wildlife in the area. He knew he was far from any known trails, yet here this bear was, presenting him with food. He hesitated at first. Was this a trick? Was the bear simply toying with him before attacking? But as the bear lowered its massive head and lay down a few feet away, its eyes steady on Ethan, he realized that the animal wasn't threatening him, it was helping him. His stomach growled. The berries looked safe enough, and with his supplies dwindling, Ethan had little choice. Slowly, he reached out and grabbed a few, bringing them to his mouth. They were tart, with a slightly earthy taste, but they provided a much-needed burst of energy. As he chewed, his mind began to clear, and he felt a strange sense of gratitude. The bear hadn't just spared him, it had actively provided for him, in its own way. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the bear. He wasn't sure the bear understood, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he wasn't alone in this. The bear continued to watch him, never moving too close but staying nearby. It seemed almost protective. Ethan glanced at his leg again, the swelling more pronounced than before, and he knew that he needed more than just berries to survive. But for now, the food was a small comfort in the vast wilderness that felt both suffocating and liberating at the same time. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself adjusting to the rhythm of the wilderness. The pain in his leg remained a constant companion, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. Instead, he focused on the bear, trying to understand its behavior. Why was it still here? Why had it not left him to fend for himself, as most animals would? He had heard the stories, the ones that painted bears as fierce, unrelenting predators, but Baron didn't fit that image. There was something different about this bear. Something wise. At some point during the afternoon, Ethan had managed to shift his position slightly, using a small rock for leverage to stretch his stiff muscles. He winced with every movement, but the bear watched from a distance, its gaze sharp but unthreatening. It didn't approach him, but it didn't leave either. It remained a steady presence, like a guardian. Every now and then, it would shift its position, but it always stayed within sight, never straying too far. Ethan's stomach growled again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He reached for more of the berries and ate them slowly, savoring the sustenance they provided. For the first time in days, his energy levels felt like they were returning, just a little. Baron moved again, sniffing the air and scanning the surroundings. Ethan followed the bear's gaze, wondering what it was sensing. The bear's sharp instincts, honed over years of surviving in these mountains, seemed to guide its every movement. Ethan knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to trust Baron, no matter how strange or unpredictable it seemed. The bear huffed softly, then padded to a small patch of tall grass, where it began to paw at the earth again. Ethan watched with growing curiosity. Was it looking for something else? Then, the bear paused, its ears twitching as if it had heard something in the distance. Ethan tensed, wondering what had caught the bear's attention. But the bear didn't move. Instead, it sat down and turned to look at him, as if waiting for something. Ethan swallowed hard, the realization dawning on him. The bear wasn't just surviving alongside him, it was teaching him how to survive in this wild, unpredictable place. The days blurred together for Ethan, each one spent in a haze of pain, fatigue, and survival. His injury had worsened. The swelling in his leg had grown, and his fever had taken a steady grip on his body. He felt as if his whole existence had been reduced to the ache in his leg, the constant gnawing hunger, and the growing realization that the longer he stayed out here, the slimmer his chances became. The weather, which had been relatively mild in the beginning, had turned cold again. The nights were especially brutal. He could feel the biting chill creeping into his bones, no matter how tightly he wrapped himself in the emergency blanket. And though the bear, whom he had now begun calling Baron, remained by his side, always close enough to keep watch, it became clear to Ethan that the wilderness was not going to make this easy. The peace he had once hoped for had given way to the stark reality of survival. The bear, ever watchful, had kept its distance during the day, but never strayed too far. It seemed to sense Ethan's suffering. At times, Baron would nudge Ethan gently with its massive paw, offering small comforts, an encouraging growl or a nudge toward a nearby stream or a cache of food it had found. It was clear that the bear had become not just a companion, but a protector, moving with a sense of purpose that Ethan could not understand fully, but nonetheless appreciated. But even Baron's steady presence couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that was starting to settle in. Ethan had tried to assess the situation logically. He had used what little knowledge he had, stabilizing his leg, rationing his supplies, and drinking from the stream that Baron had led him to, but the infection in his leg had become his biggest enemy. It wasn't just a matter of pain now, it was the fear that the infection would spread, that his body would give out before anyone could find him. Ethan lay on his back, staring up at the canopy above him. The cold had seeped in, and his fever was high. Every time he moved, the pain in his leg was overwhelming. The sense of isolation weighed heavily on him. He had come out here to escape his problems, to find peace in the mountains, but instead, it felt like the mountains were forcing him to confront every fear and doubt he'd ever buried deep inside. The darkness was falling, and with it came a chill that cut through him like a knife. He shivered uncontrollably as he huddled deeper into his blanket. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his body ached with the fever. Each breath was an effort, each thought a struggle. He couldn't stop thinking about how things had gone so wrong, his divorce, his failed attempts to fix everything, the years of running away from the things that truly mattered. He had come out here to escape, but all he had found was more of himself. Then, as if on cue, Baron appeared. The bear emerged from the shadows, its large frame filling the space between the trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, and then stopped just a few feet away from Ethan. The intensity of its gaze was familiar now, unwavering, focused, as if it could see through the haze of Ethan's fever. The bear lowered its head slightly, its nose twitching, and for a moment, Ethan thought it might leave him. But then, without warning, Baron nudged him, gently but insistently. The bear's eyes locked with his, its expression calm and steady, as if it were trying to tell him something. Ethan struggled to lift himself up, wincing as the pain shot through his leg, but the bear's presence was enough to keep him from succumbing to despair. "Okay, Ethan whispered hoarsely, his voice barely more than a rasp. The bear didn't move, but its gaze was unyielding. The message was clear, he needed to get up. His body protested with every movement, but the bear stood by, waiting for him to make the next move. Ethan reached for the rock beside him, using it to help him shift his weight. It was agonizing, but somehow, through sheer will and the constant nudge of Baron's presence, he managed to get to his feet. Ethan stumbled forward, his injured leg dragging painfully behind him. The bear stayed just a few steps ahead, its movements slow but purposeful. It glanced back now and then, as if ensuring Ethan was still following. There was a quiet intensity to its actions, like a guide leading him through the unknown. Every step was torture, but the bear's unwavering presence pushed him forward, step by step. The forest around them was silent except for the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional rustling of the wind. Ethan couldn't focus on the cold or the pain anymore, there was only the bear and the feeling that, for the first time in days, he wasn't alone. As they moved through the dense woods, Ethan began to notice something in the air, a faint scent of rain, something on the horizon. Baron seemed to sense it too. The bear's pace quickened slightly, its head turning toward the sky, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Ethan followed, his movements growing more labored, but he couldn't stop now. They reached the edge of a small clearing, and that's when Ethan heard it, a faint rumble, distant at first but growing louder. A storm was coming. Baron moved with urgency, pushing forward as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the sky darkened, and the wind began to pick up. The storm wasn't far off. Baron led him toward the shelter of a nearby cave, its step steady and sure. Ethan's body felt like it was on the verge of collapse, but the bear never stopped. Once they reached the cave, Baron immediately curled into a ball in the back, its large frame taking up a significant portion of the space. Ethan, feeling the storm begin to lash against the opening of the cave, collapsed next to the bear, his body too weak to continue. The storm intensified rapidly, rain pouring down in sheets, the wind howling through the trees above. Ethan could barely think, his fever setting in deeper, the pain from his leg becoming unbearable. He could feel himself slipping in and out of consciousness, his body fighting against the fever that seemed to consume him. But through the haze of his delirium, he could hear Baron's low rumbling growl, the bear's steady presence a comforting reminder that he was not alone. Hours passed, long, painful hours where the storm raged on, and Ethan's condition worsened. Every time he tried to move, the pain shot through him like a bolt of lightning, but still, the bear remained, watchful, ever present. The storm had become a fierce, unrelenting force of nature, but Ethan felt an odd sense of peace knowing that Baron was with him, a silent guardian against the chaos. As the storm howled outside, Ethan realized something profound. He was no longer just fighting to survive the wilderness. He was learning to trust it, and in doing so, trust himself again. The storm subsided slowly, the relentless downpour finally easing into a soft drizzle. Ethan lay on the cave floor, his body still trembling, but his mind clearer now. The fever had not entirely left, but his senses sharpened with each passing minute, and the oppressive weight of the wilderness had lifted just a little. Baron remained nearby, still curled into a tight ball, its eyes half closed but alert. The bear hadn't left him, and in some strange way, that was the most reassuring thing Ethan had ever known. The cave felt like a sanctuary now, sheltering him from the storm outside and the chaos inside his own head. Baron had saved him in more ways than one. The bear had protected him, guided him, and, most of all, given him something he had lost long ago, trust. Ethan glanced at the bear, the bond between them undeniable now. Baron's presence, steady and unyielding, had shown him that survival wasn't just about fighting for life, it was about learning to surrender, to accept help, and to find strength in the most unexpected places. Through the haze of pain and fever, Ethan finally understood, he wasn't meant to fight alone. He was meant to live with. As the sky brightened and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cave entrance, Ethan slowly sat up, his muscles sore but functional. Baron was up now too, stretching, its massive body shifting in the morning light. The air had a crisp freshness to it, and the rain had washed away much of the heaviness from the night. Ethan's body screamed in protest as he tested his weight on his injured leg, but it held. Barely. With Baron beside him, Ethan took one slow, painful step toward the mouth of the cave. For the first time in days, he didn't feel alone. The bear stood at the edge of the cave, looking back at him, its gaze patient, but expectant. Ethan's heart beat with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Somehow, through this journey, through the pain, the fear, and the isolation, he had learned to survive not just because of Baron, but with Baron. Just as he reached the cave's entrance, a distant, familiar sound broke the stillness, the whir of helicopter blades. Ethan froze, blinking at the clearing ahead, his mind struggling to make sense of it. The bear shifted, turning toward the sound as well, its massive form still a steady anchor in the chaos. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as the helicopter drew closer. His limbs trembled with the effort to keep moving, but his body had reached its limit. Baron took one last glance at him, and then, with a soft snort, disappeared back into the woods, vanishing into the mist. The helicopter hovered overhead, and Ethan's hope soared with it. As the rescue team reached down with a rope ladder, Ethan felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude, not just for his salvation, but for the unexpected guardian who had kept him alive. As he was hoisted up toward the helicopter, Ethan looked back one last time. The bear was gone, but its spirit would remain with him forever. Baron had given him something he hadn't known he needed, a second chance. And as the helicopter ascended, Ethan realized that this time, he would live differently. He wouldn't just survive, he would live with purpose. And that purpose would be to protect and honor the wild, just as Baron had done for him. The story of Ethan and Baron holds a profound message about survival, trust, and the unexpected ways in which help can come into our lives. In the wilderness, Ethan learns that survival isn't just about physical endurance or fighting to stay alive, it's also about surrendering to the process, accepting vulnerability, and forming connections with the world around us. Baron, the bear, symbolizes the importance of trusting not just others but also the environment that sustains us. In the face of overwhelming adversity, Ethan's bond with the bear teaches him to appreciate the simple yet vital lessons of interdependence and resilience. In real-life application, this story resonates with the challenges many face today, whether emotional, physical, or situational. Just as Ethan had to confront his isolation and pain, many of us must learn to accept help and trust in our surroundings. Life often throws us into situations where we feel out of control or vulnerable, but it is through these experiences that we grow stronger. The story reminds us that help can come from unexpected places, and sometimes, survival requires us to trust and adapt to what we cannot control, ultimately finding strength through connection and understanding.